What makes a Nord beautiful? What is it about an orc woman that makes her attractive to an orc chieftain who is looking for a third wife? What would make a high elf stare at themselves for hours in the mirror? Probably not a whole lot, to be honest. In the real world, what's considered beautiful or conventionally attractive, a standard that people would strive towards, differs from country to country, from nation to nation. It's also something that develops over time and changes as ideas go in and out of style or the big corporations want to sell you something new. Tamriel is similar to this in the way that no two races will perceive beauty in the exact same way, and every culture will have a different idea of what it means to be conventionally attractive, though that does not mean that people will only be attracted to the members of their own race. You have to take into account personal preferences, circumstances, and of course, the overlap in these standards across different races. Today, we're going to explore the perception of beauty in Tamriel across the different races, and how that has changed over time in the newer Elder Scrolls games. Before we get started, hi, my name is Angelika, and I think that there's nothing more beautiful than reading an Elder Scroll. But you wouldn't know anything about that, would you? So why is this topic important at all? Well, we know that there are people in Tamriel who put a lot of value on beauty, considering that one of the core deities of the Cyrodiilic pantheon, Debella, is the goddess of beauty and love. Her teachings encourage seeing beauty in that which is nurtured and cared for. No matter the seed, if the shoot is nurtured with love, will not the flower be beautiful? She does not ask to conform to one set beauty standard, but instead to keep your heart open to beauty in its varying and diverse forms, no matter the seed or the race. She is a controversial divine, as her teachings also encourage practices such as polyamory, which is having multiple partners, and exploring one's sexuality, which, in the eyes of some, can be taken too far by certain individuals. What some interpret as spreading love and beauty in the land, others have branded as lustful and devious practices. There exist many depictions of Debella, some of which were actually expanded on in ESO, but for the most part what we have seen in the main Elder Scrolls games are statues or images of a long-haired, slender figure, usually nude and having prominent features. My favorite depictions of Debella are the statues in Skyrim, some of which are multicolored and adorned with gems. Those always accidentally end up in my player home. I don't know how. There is some indication from Debella as to what should not be considered beautiful, or rather what sort of relationships one shouldn't have. This includes vampires or any other kind of undead. This especially makes sense when you look at how vampires were initially created, the ravaging of Lamay Bal, a perversion and desecration of love by the Daedric prince of enslavement and domination, Molag Bal. He represents everything that goes directly against the teachings of Debella. Now, there are actually two divines which are said to be the goddesses of love. Those are Debella and Mara, but in Mara's case, she's more so the divine of love, compassion, marriage. Debella is different because her teachings would sort of go against the idea of traditional marriage, encouraging polyamory, and there's definitely more of a focus and emphasis on physical attraction and physical love. So what is beauty on Tamriel? What makes somebody attractive? There are two ways to look at this. One is by looking at people as they are in each of the Elder Scrolls games and comparing it against the standards in our real world for whatever the time was that a particular game came out in. Another is by delving into the cultural context and the specifics of each race and what the people of Tamriel value based on our observations. Let's take a look at the first way, where we delve into each game and when it came out. I actually want to start this by speaking about Daggerfall, which focuses heavily on the appearance of all characters, the NPCs and the player character alike, despite the limitations of its time. So, Daggerfall came out in 1996. Before we look at Daggerfall, let's take a look at what kind of movies were popular in the 90s in our real world and how the characters looked there. A really good example is Mel Gibson's Braveheart from 1995. First of all, the men. William Wallace was the image of peak masculinity and strength. The long wild mane, chiseled facial features, strong build. If you then look at Daggerfall character creation, all of the races aside from Argonians have a similar look. Jawlines so sharp they could cut steel, long hair, big beards, angry facial expressions. It's funny to me how some of the Khajiit look more like Nords than the actual Nords do, and for the rest of them the only distinctions are skin color and ears. elf ears or human ears. This would have been the standard according to the time in which Daggerfall was released, and it's not just the player character where you see this. The NPCs also had this gritty, chiseled, high fantasy look about them. Like, this is not the face of somebody that has seen an iPhone. Not even close. The women then similarly appeared to have been inspired by what was considered the height of medieval high fantasy beauty in Hollywood. Looking at the same example of Braveheart, Princess Isabel was this graceful, feminine beauty. She had that no makeup look, which was so skillfully done to highlight her natural features and bring them out, instead of exaggerating or changing her face. She had long, beautiful hair, and the clothing and jewelry that she wears in the film was also this bright, saturated color. The dresses were long and flowy, accentuating her figure. First of all, on the clothing point, I've already done a video breaking down all of the clothing items in Daggerfall, and here we explored how masterfully done each of the pieces were, and how it's a shame that we don't see more of that in later games. The colors were stunning, the designs were unique and eye-catching, like even the NPCs are really memorable to me because of how beautifully they are dressed, and I haven't even played that much Daggerfall, but it still had so much of an impact on me. Long, beautiful hair was also something that NPCs in particular have. There's less of that when it comes to your own character creation, but honestly it's something that I've come to expect from games in general. For some reason, in any character creation, there's very limited long hair options for creating a female character. And that's just across the board, not in any game in particular. One of my favorite examples is Princess Morgaya, who has all of those elements that we talked about, but there are plenty of female NPCs in the game that follow that particular look. And again, it just shows that this was absolutely the beauty standard. How much you read into that in terms of lore and world implications is really up to you, but I believe they are this way just because it was what the standards were at the time in the real world. Morrowind then is a lot harder to read, in my opinion. Mainly because the game features such an alien world, so different from the typically European-esque medieval high fantasy setting that we would be used to from before. The faces of both the men and the women are rather chiseled, thin, but with the clothing and armor in the game, there's a lot less of an accent on their bodies. However, one thing that is apparent, at least to me, is that the bodies of the characters, especially females, were likely modeled to fit the standard of being extremely thin, yet having very long legs, a generally toned body, and a bigger bust. Admittedly, it kind of looks scary in Morrowind, but I think it's just due to the limitations of the time. However, in the year that the game came out, this was generally the idea of the beauty standard, that Barbie body. Morrowind is also the game where all of the races started having features which highlighted their individuality. You can clearly distinguish all of the elves, the Khajiit look like cats, etc. So it's a lot harder to look at the game with that blanket point of view that we had for Daggerfall, where almost everyone followed the same look. I don't personally think that beauty or beautiful NPCs were the main goals of the developers at the time either. Morrowind is again a really gritty alien world. I think beauty was supposed to be this more unattainable thing. I think this is especially true if you think of who is the most beautiful NPC in Morrowind. Now this is just my opinion, but because of the way the features were highlighted here and there's a clear effort to make her stand out, I actually think it's Almalexia. I honestly don't know who can compete with that. Do not say Fargoth. Oblivion then is an interesting one to look at because the characters look vastly different to the previous games. The Oblivion face is a whole concept of its own. And here's the thing with that. To this day, r/Oblivion gets flooded with posts of people trying to make an attractive character without any mods in Oblivion. It's become like a sport. But even without trying so hard, there are a few observations that we can make to see what are the particular standards that are being followed. First of all, the hair. Yes, the hair. Everybody's hair in Oblivion is very oily. A lot of styles are slicked back. They have this almost wet hair look. Now, Oblivion came out in 2006, and in the early 2000s, this gelled, slick back hairstyle was really popular. Both men and women were putting gel into their hair to achieve this perfect, smoothed down look. Now, maybe for the men in particular, you saw a lot more of this spiked up, messy look, but it was still a lot of hair gel that was used. People's faces are also very shiny in Oblivion, similar to how makeup was done in the early 2000s. Also, the men can't have beards. Well, one man can, but I guess the beards weren't so popular for men in the early 2000s. Finally, Skyrim is a difficult one to pinpoint, but this was the first time where we got such realistic looking faces for the characters. This was the early 2010s, so not much changed really in terms of the standard for body types in our real world, and we can kind of see that they played it safe by giving every race the same body, but the faces are what you would see as conventionally attractive, very symmetrical. The men still appear quite masculine, although in my opinion, it's not as exaggerated as it was in Daggerfall. Again, these are all just observations that I've made about the games based on the time that they were released, but this doesn't necessarily mean anything lore-wise, or it wasn't necessarily intended as canon. So what about the things that do appear to be standards in their world if you take away our real-world observations or comparisons? I think the best way to break this down would be to look at it race by race, so let's start with the Altmer. It's possible that a lot of the stereotypes that we associate with them come from the Aldmeri Dominion more than anything, but that's only because of how prevalent the Thalmor were in Skyrim and how memorable all of those NPCs are. Even the actors that voiced Thalmor roles sound like they think that they're better than you. This specific condescending tone that they have, no matter what the conversation, you feel like you're being scolded.
I am Elenwen, the Thalmor ambassador to Skyrim. And you are?
For them, beauty is found in fine clothing, jewelry, and authority. Anyone that has been to Solitude knows that one high elf that stops you as you're on your way to the Blue Palace. Surely you're not thinking of wearing that. Now, they say this to you even if you are wearing fine clothes just before you meet them, so it can be interpreted as they just want to sell you something, but it's likely that the first time that you're playing, you're not going to expect that, so you'll be wearing some armor, and I think that that's what it was scripted for. In which case, the criticism really is about your sense of style, or lack thereof. Dark elves then are different. Even in Morrowind, a game that is centered around the homeland of this race, we don't see a whole lot of emphasis on physical beauty, especially if we're looking at it to establish an understanding of a particular standard. As a race, the Dark Elves have been through a lot, starting with the fact that before they were Dunmer, they were Chimer, a race of golden, pale skin just like the modern-day Altmer. They broke away from the Somerset Isles and followed their prophet Beloth to Morrowind, where after the Battle of the Red Mountain, they were cursed by Azura. All Chimer were changed into Dunmer, and our skins turned ashen and our eyes into fire. They had undergone this radical change that physical beauty and adhering to a particular standard can be a sensitive topic. This isn't something that they put a lot of value on. Instead, we can discern that they focus a lot more on things like status. There's a lot to be said for elves associated with a particular great house or the rank that they hold within said house. It's also interesting how this specifically is a Morrowind thing, and the Dark Elves themselves recognize that it doesn't carry any weight outside of the province.
I'm Falano, House Lalo, as if that matters here.
The Dunmer are a practical people, and it can also be said that they worry less about physical beauty and appearing attractive because elven children are slow to come. This example comes from the real Baranzaya, who failed to conceive a child for many years. On that same example, Baranzaya is one of the most prominent dark elven figures in Tamrielic history. It was said that even the Emperor was in awe of her beauty. Her many love affairs were documented in the real Baranzaya book series, where, as the reader, you are given the impression that she was this otherworldly beauty, but I don't believe that she serves as an actual example or beauty standards for the dark elven women. For the Bosmer then, I looked at the sort of racial bonuses that they have in each of the games, and generally there's a focus on things like speed, sneaking, archery. They are an agile and fit race, whose beauty standards would therefore be centered around physical health and fitness. A toned physique and cannibalistic tendencies is all you need. I'm just kidding. They don't really do that. Not anymore. You can look at Bretons and Imperials together since their cultures are rather similar, and as races of men, they would likely look towards the same things as standards of beauty. In the game Daggerfall, we meet a lot of Breton nobility, and I think this is actually the game where you really have the most standout depictions of Bretons as a race. Otherwise, I personally have found them to be quite unremarkable physically when it comes to the other games. The nobles are depicted as wearing a lot of jewelry, beautiful clothing, and it's like this in Cyrodiil as well, particularly in Oblivion, where we see the counts and countesses in the finest clothing wearing jewelry. Now, the difference with Bretons is that they are actually half-elf, and because of that they are considered intelligent, usually proficient in magic, and those are some of the things that could be seen as a standard. peak Breton performance. Imperials then, similarly to High Elves, would also put a lot of value on status. Your name. Nords then are a hardy people from the northern province of Skyrim. The climate and terrain of their province are not for the faint of heart, and so the standard across the board for both men and women is physical strength. In these harsh conditions, they need to be able to work the land, take care of their families, and even some of the women choose to fight and become great warriors. Specifically the women that are warriors, they're presented to us in such a way that even as the player, you will naturally remember them as the most beautiful NPCs in the game. Ayla the Huntress, Mjol the Lioness, Lydia. For Redguards, there was an interesting detail that was explored in Elder Scrolls Online, Morwa, the Yakutan goddess of fertility and love. She is apparently supposed to be more conservative than Debella, or less lustful, but her depiction in ESO shows a woman with a large bust, what looks like a baby bump. She's supposed to be the image of fertility and possibly an indication as to what the Redguard people look towards in terms of beauty. Of course, there's that and curved swords. Orcs, similarly to Nords, value physical strength and see that as beauty. In Skyrim, we meet the orc chieftains in the strongholds, who gain their position by defeating the previous, older, weaker chieftain. The chieftains in a stronghold are the only ones that have the right to take wives and produce heirs, to guarantee the strongest offspring to come after them. Orc women are also sturdy, hardworking, often they have professions like blacksmiths, and they don't back down from a fight. My favorite example of this is Mazoga the orc, who wanted nothing more than to become a knight. A Brienne of Tarth kind of beauty. Peak orc female performance. Now, Argonians and Khajiit are a lot more difficult to read, so I did kind of have to take some real life observations and mix them into this as well, even though I said I wouldn't, but stay with me. For example, with Argonians, I looked at what real lizards find attractive in a potential mate. We know in nature that mostly the females are the ones who get to choose their mate and be picky, but in the case of lizards, sometimes the males are the ones that get to choose. You know, the lizards with the podcasts. Just as you'd imagine, they are most attracted to the bright colors of a potential mate, and in the Elder Scrolls, the Argonians are very colorful indeed. I think specific to Elder Scrolls then, jewelry or head adornment is something that they like in particular, seeing as a lot of it's actually built into the character creation in the game as part of the hair options. I took a similar approach when thinking about Khajiit. Lions, for example, value big manes. The darker, the better, apparently, and physical fitness. Even their racial benefits in the games are what you would expect in terms of cat skills, like agility bonuses, sneaking, night eye. Similarly to Argonians, there is a bit of the head adornment trend as well that we see in the character creation. Now that covers all of the race's specific standards, but what I like in the Elder Scrolls is that this does not mean that there are no mixed race relationships. The people of Tamriel, as individuals, all have their preferences. It is true in some cases that opposites attract. We have seen a Khajiit and a Dark Elf, I know you know, a Wood Elf and an Imperial, Helga and half of Riften's male population. They don't have to discriminate. There's a few examples like this in the game, but I've always found it funny how when entering Riverwood, Sigrid will tell the female player characters to stay away from her husband Alvor, because you're pretty. She says this to you regardless of what race you are. Alvor does not discriminate. Alvor likes everybody. And so, beauty on Tamriel truly is in the eye of the beholder. But just like in real life, we can see that there are some pre-established ideas and standards for each of the races, even with some overlap with our own real-world ideas. I really enjoy exploring topics like this because it really is a testament to the depth and intricacy of the Elder Scrolls universe, and there's just so much more than meets the eye. Sometimes you just have to read between the lines. And that covers it for our beauty standards in the Elder Scrolls video. I really enjoyed making this video and delving into all of that. You can kind of see there's a trend with the sort of topics that I like to talk about, and anything to do with fashion, beauty, clothing, those are definitely my specialties and my favorite areas to talk about. Let me know in the comments what are some of the observations that you have made in terms of beauty standards on Tamriel. And that's all for now. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Thank you to my channel members for all of your continued support. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Be seeing you. Bye!